Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for being here today. This is the second time we've been full today. I'm pastor at Grace United Methodist Church, which is a new congregation here in town, and we've been privileged enough to be able to meet here on Sunday mornings for worship, and so it's been a real blessing to us to be able to be here. So let's gather for a word of prayer. Gracious Heavenly Father, thank you for the beauty of this day and the beauty of this moment that we share together. We thank you for those whose vision years ago saw that there should be a house of worship here, and their vision sustained your call, and their work and efforts continue to grow. And because they did their work so faithfully in those years gone by, we're able to gather here today to celebrate these wonderful folks, Henry and Clara Davis, who remember today, and all those who have helped during the years to keep this place a sacred spot. So grant us the wonderful grace of your presence today as we remember and we recall and we dedicate this organ for the continued ministries that will continue to bloom here and grow here as long as you call us to do so. We ask in Christ's name. Amen.
Welcome everybody to this grand occasion that just has exceeded all of our expectations. The city bought this property a few years ago because it was in danger of, it was for sale, and it was zoned residential, and we just were afraid that it would not be saved. And so we talked our very amenable and agreeable city manager, Keith Dickerson, who's sitting right back there, into buying the property. And we have a dream of being able to connect this property with this property, connect downtown to Pitts Park. So we are, that is our vision, that we will be able to do that. But we thought in the meantime we would be able to maybe hold some small receptions in there, but really that didn't happen. I will back up a little bit and say that the chapel, and you will hear more about the history of the chapel from the black history. I'm not going to let them tell you that. But the building was restored some years ago, and so we are grateful for that. The former owner had plans for it, but anyway, we really wasn't much in demand. And then about maybe 6 months or so ago, some of the Methodists came to City Hall and said, we're looking for a place to worship, and we wonder if maybe we could use your chapel. And we said, fantastic. And so it has been such a pleasure to work with this group, and I think that it's going to be a great partnership. We're glad you're here. And also one thing I want to thank everybody who has contributed to today's event. I know that Audrey has worked very hard getting in touch with speakers. We've got family members who came from places afar. We've had our city guys who have put up the tent for us, and so it really has been a joint effort on the part of a lot of people, and we're glad it's finally here, so we'll enjoy.
Yes, to today's service and dedication. And first I want to start by thanking all of you for being here today. This is very special. First, in memory of Henry and Clara Davis, who graced this chapel for decades in the 1920s all the way through the 1970s, and in whose honor and memory we will dedicate this organ in a little bit later in our program. We also welcome in memory their daughter Mercedes, who is no longer with us, but we honor her presence. We know that all three of them are looking down, they're smiling, they're having as much fun as we're having in here. But to their memory. And now I'm excited to introduce two people to you. And let's start. Lucy, can you stand up? Can you at least wave? Yeah. There we go. Lucy is fighting arthritis, and at 90 years of age, she's doing great. But this is Lucy Davis Bland, one of the three daughters of Henry and Clara, and she came all the way from Arizona. So we are so happy that all right, and this is Jeannene Davis Gosey, and Jeannene lives in Lawrenceville, so she's just an hour down the road if anybody wants to go visit with her. They obviously grew up here. They went to this church. They had a fantastic family. They lived on a farm just on the outside of Clarkesville. To have them here today at 90 years of age and in great health, great mind, is just absolutely fantastic. We're just so happy that you're here. And did I get those? All right. And Evelyn Davis Harmon. I have a rose for you as well. And being the niece, we certainly appreciate your role in the family, and you're going to hear shortly from Evelyn, so hang on, and she's got a great story and a lot of good information to share with us. So, Reverend Randy Gumiki?
Yeah. Randy? Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Oh.
This is for you.
Oh, thank you.
We want to thank you, and we want to thank your congregation for letting us use the facility. I know your service this morning, we got your bulletin, but you know, there's something very powerful and profound in this bulletin, and it says, a simple place from a simpler time with a simple message that you are loved. This is what the congregation is bringing to this church, to this chapel now. That simple message, you are loved, we're going to play all that today, okay?
All right.
I think if you want to put it all into perspective, everybody is here today because they're loved. Everybody is here today to celebrate Henry and Clara and their family because their family is loved. So we're just really, really happy with it, but thank you. I also want to thank Barry, our esteemed mayor of Clarksville. It really is special that the mayor and the city and the elected officials have restored this building, right? I mean, this is absolutely amazing. I know it leans a little bit this way. If it leans too much, I'm going to ask the people over here to shift over to the other side. But this is just incredible that the facility was restored. And along with that, Barry was looking for help to try to find a way to get the original organ working in here. And through conversations that she had with Audrey and connecting the dots, we found out about it. And we could find no better thing to do than to get this organ completely rebuilt, completely restored, back in its presence here for everybody to enjoy. And that we wanted to do it from the men and women of Standard Telephone Company, and we wanted it to be done in dedication of Henry and Clara Davis. If we can all remember or we were all here 50 years ago, 60 years, 70 years ago, Clara was sitting right here playing this organ, this exact organ. Later today, you're going to get to sing some of the favorite hymns from the family with the organ going. So we're just super excited, but from the perspective of the city of Clarksville, we can't thank you enough for restoring this. We're glad that we had a tiny part to get this organ working in good order.
I want to interrupt and tell you exactly how long it took from the time I contacted Audrey about the organ until we had the money in hand, and I think it was 12 hours.
It was an emphatic yes.
I may have to put him in charge of some other things.
Oh, if it only worked that way every time. Okay, Audrey, if you'll hold that for a moment. And Dr. Mello chair. So I also want to thank and recognize area historians, if I can call you that. You're much more than that, but from a historian perspective, capturing what happened over the last 100 years in this chapel is very important. What went on with our colored community as it was portrayed at the time was very important. We all love history, we all love learning. We're moving into a new generation. Most of the kids have cell phones. They're not looking at things that happened in the past. You know, they're more concerned about what they're wearing that day, right? But it truly is great that from a history perspective, the history of this chapel has been kept in decent shape. The Tri-County Advertiser, we'll talk about Peter Madruga in a minute, but there were over 100 articles written in the newspapers back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s about this community and about this chapel and what was going on with the family members, with things that were happening on a day-to-day basis. But what I would like to say with Dr. Turner and Audrey, they have worked a long time, what, 10, 20 years on, or more, on what is a combination of the Habersham County Historical Society and also a separate organization that is the African American Museum of Northeast Georgia, the regional African American Museum of Northeast Georgia. And it's through a lot of that work that we know about the Davis family, Deas Chapel, what was going on, obviously, in the city of Clarksville at the time. Audrey went one step above and beyond to help organize this entire event today. So I can't thank the two of you ladies enough. Also, from a historical perspective, when Evelyn talks in a little bit, you'll hear that she knows a lot about history too, and a lot about what happened here. So in a lot of ways, we're all historians. Peter Madruga in the back, who's making our video today, he digitized the newspapers going all the way back to the early part of the 1900s, and through that effort was able to very quickly, when we called Peter and said, hey, can you pull together every article you can find about the Davis family, about Deas Chapel, he was able to do that, do it very quickly. On the flight from Arizona to here, Lucy and I had a great time. We pulled up all those old articles about her family. When Jeannene went to New York and broke her arm, that was written in the local paper here about that event, right? I mean, I can't tell you, but one of the things we found reading through those articles is that Clara was doing an awful lot behind the scenes. Clara Davis was organizing the youth in this congregation. Remember when all the kids had to have vaccines and how hard it was to actually get vaccines? She organized to have all the kids brought in here, medical people to come in, and to get all the kids vaccinated. She did that on her own effort to make sure those kids were protected. That's one story out of 100 stories that you can read about, but it truly is amazing. But from the perspective of history, I think that's very important. next thank you goes to my Aunt Carolyn. So, calling my Aunt Carolyn a historian may be a little awkward, but the truth is, during her time at Standard Telephone Company, she, and where's Sally Welburn? I'm sorry. But she and Sally and a number of other people spent a tremendous amount of time documenting the history of Standard Telephone Company over a period of 70 years when H.M. Stewart had the company, but even 10 or 20 years before that. So a lot of what we know about Henry Davis and the family and his role at Standard Telephone Company and the community was documented in a series of books that Carolyn and others put together. Last year, those books were digitized and sent to the Digital Library of Georgia. If you go on Google now and you type in Henry Davis or Clara Davis, it will pull up the very documents, these books, these articles, everything that Carolyn and so many people worked so hard on. So from a historian perspective, Carolyn, thank you. You have preserved that story. It's there now for everybody to see. All right. And I want to thank Michael Morris. So Michael could not be here today, but he is the gentleman that restored this organ. I'm not a musician by any means, but what I know about the organ, people either called it a pump organ, because you got to pump the pedals, or a reed organ. The reeds inside that organ are wooden channels, if you will. And the reed is a metal insert that goes inside that wooden channel. And when you're pumping the air, it's got to be so tight that the air goes through that wooden channel into that reed, and that reed produces the music, the noise, the sounds. Yeah. So you don't, in 2024, you don't just go to somebody and say, can you restore an organ? Do you happen to have an extra reed laying around? This is hard work. So it was easy for us in 12 hours to raise the money. What wasn't easy is it took months and months and months where Michael Morris took this thing apart and rebuilt the whole thing. At the end, I think he had just about at least 95% of it completely restored. There's a few reeds that literally you just can't find anywhere. And we may or may not be able to get it 100%, but it's 95%. When you hear it, you're going to love it. But to Michael Morris, who did the heavy lifting, he did the hard work, we really appreciate it. And I want to close thanking Bruce, but Bruce isn't here yet. Okay. Bruce will be coming in, Bruce Brownlow will be coming in a little bit. He'll be playing the organ. And we can't thank him enough. But that will conclude my remarks right now.
Thank you so much for having me. At least I can walk in. And I'm so glad to do that. And I'm so thankful for the restoration of this building. The last 2 years that it was an active church, I played piano in their service. So I'm really glad to be here. About 15 years ago, I was asked by Andrea Harper to chair a Black History display for the February that was coming up, and I believe 2009. And as I thought about what I needed to do, the first person in the African American community in Northeast Georgia that needed to be lifted up because of achievements and contributions made was Henry Davis. And the rest was built around it, and all that after that is history. So it was a pleasure to do that. He and my dad were not exactly contemporaries, but kind of in that they both did things in the black community and the white community, in church and home and families, and had a lot of influence in the area. So I am just really pleased. The organ, the dedication, the Davis family, the history we're going to hear, it couldn't be more perfect. All I did was collect materials. I didn't contribute to any of this. Sometimes collecting can be arduous. But I talked to a lot of people, I went to a lot of places, and we were able to get just a few things to start off. And when Habersham County Historical Society entered the picture with their telephone museum, guess who a key early person was? Henry Davis. And so we were tied together at the hip from that point. And that is the past. And to quote a line from a very familiar hymn for black people who lift every voice and sing, where the white gleam of our bright star is cast. I will move now to the future and let Audrey Davenport take it from there, because the good thing about living in the present is you have the good and the bad and the interesting and the shameful and the pleasant and everything from the past to learn. And you have a vision of the future that you hope for. So to all of you who are present here today, you're a part of the history from this point on. And thank you for all that you've done from the city, individuals, and all that you were here. I am just really pleased to be inside this building one more time. Thank you. Audrey. And my first name is Audrey, and my family, J.R. Rosser and his wife Pauline, and my sister Sujette, all three who have now gone to glory, and me, moved to Cornelia in 1958, the summer of 1958. I had graduated from high school. My sister had been in college for 3 years. My dad was the third principal of the colored school in 1958, and he remained there until it was closed in 1966. Well, when I first came, there was a young man who was very interested in me, and I really liked him as well. He has also gone on to glory. But his name was, it wasn't Cookie, James Gibson. We called him Cookie. And his sister was expecting a baby. When that baby came, it was a girl. He suggested naming her Audrey, which her mother did. And that's Audrey Davenport there. So we've been connected at the hip and the knee and ankle since that time. Audrey.
Miss Rosser. I call her Miss Rosser because her mother was my first grade teacher at the public school. And that was Miss Rosser. So thank you for that story. And Uncle Cookie was my favorite uncle. And it was my mom's favorite brother, so that's how he got to name me. So Miss Rosser came to my mom's house and asked, but she heard I had some skills that could move the regional African American display and artifacts into another zone, and so that was my job. I'm proud to be connected to the Regional African American Museum, and especially for Ms. Rosser. So what I want to do at this chapel today was to make certain that anybody walking into this building would know that the original congregation was African American. So I have it's not permanent, but it is a small little display right out there by the podium where you sign in that we hope to make into a permanent plaque. And along with that, I think should be a permanent plaque in here, always near this organ of Mr. Henry and Miss Clara, who, by the way, I did hear Miss Clara play that organ 1 or 2 times. As me and my sisters, we lived down the street in Clarkesville for a year, and I actually integrated the 2nd grade in Clarkesville. So I won't talk much more about that. I will go ahead and say that my memory of Miss Clara playing that organ was just wonderful. You know, it was just wonderful. So after Mr. Will Lockwood speaks about Deas, I'm sorry, is Miss Evelyn next? Miss Evelyn is going to do the history of Deas Chapel, and after that we'll do the memories of Deas. And then we'd ask anybody who had any memories to speak a little bit about that. Thank you, Miss Evelyn. And Miss Evelyn, by the way, every time I ask, she comes. Miss Evelyn was with us in this chapel for the first ever Juneteenth event in 2018. It was hosted by the Historical Society, and Miss Hodges is right here. She's been a long time member of the Harrison County Historical Society, who I've had the pleasure to work with for years also. Thank you, Miss Evelyn.
We get to be 28 twice. It's nice. Turn that around. 82. My mother-in-law, before I begin, I'd like to say something that my late mother-in-law said about Clarkesville. She was a person that I loved dearly, and many times it's been customary to speak ill of mother-in-laws. But my mother-in-law came to Clarkesville. She grew up in South Georgia. And usually when I came home, she would come with me. And after coming and visiting the area, she said, you know, this is a unique place. It's not like where we're from. They were from Macon County, Georgia. She said the situations here are different, living conditions are different. Everything is different. She's very receptive. And I think about her so many times for time she spent coming to Clarkesville and finding that it was a unique place. And when I talk about the Deas family today, you're going to find some of the things that I say about them is also unique. So I'll say good afternoon, and I want to thank the committee for inviting me. I'm a poor speaker, but I do have lots of information to give, so I think that's why they asked me to come back. But thank you for inviting me. I was told by Audrey to talk about Charles and Amanda Nash Deas, and that's what I'm going to do today. When I was doing my family history, and that's really what I started out, I'm not a historian, I'm just a person who wanted to find out more about my family. And in doing so, I began to turn up information about just about every African-American family in Clarkesville, because we are connected in some way. At that time, people didn't have long ways to range, to drive, to go somewhere and visit, to court girls in other places. So they basically married people right around this area, and as a result, many of us are related. As a result, I was told that to talk about these two people, and I started by looking at an article that I had written for the Georgia Backroads back in the winter of '22. I did an article about Charles Deas, and it was called The Price of Living Free. Charles Deas is mentioned on the Clarkesville walking tour. He had a brochure, and there were 19 stops on that walking tour. This chapel was stop 14. The brochure says the building was moved from another site to the land on which it now sits, but it was across the street really. And that land was donated by Mrs. Amanda Deas of Clarkesville during the latter part of the 1800s. According to the description in that brochure, Amanda owned land across the county, and she operated a restaurant up on the square. So if you looked at that, you said, well, where did an African-American woman at that time get money to own land across the county and to operate a restaurant? The answer was her husband, Charles. She hadn't earned that money. She hadn't worked for it. She inherited it from her husband. Well, who was he? Charles Deas was a mulatto. He was a free person of color. He was a farmer. He was a retail merchant. And he was a real estate investor. And a taxpayer, I think I said. And that was quite an accomplishment for a man who lived before the Civil War, during the Civil War, and after the Civil War. I can't tell you exactly when Charles Deas was born. I can't tell you who his mother was or his father. The 1860 United States Census of Free People and the 1870 census lists his year of birth as 1807, and that seems to be exact because everywhere we see him mentioned, those years come up. Those of you who've done research will know that the 1870 census is referred to as a brick wall. Many African Americans cannot go beyond that brick wall because we were not listed by name. But in the 1860 census, Charles Deas was listed. And I'm going to inject him and say, so was my great-great-grandmother. I'll tell you later how she related to this church. How did Charles become free? I don't have an answer for that. He may have been freed by his slave owner through the process called manumission. Sometimes men who fathered children by slave women wanted these offsprings to have a better life, and they granted them their freedom. Another possible way he may have gained his freedom was to work and buy it. After completing work for a master, a slave, if he had a trade, could be allowed to work for someone else. And the wages that he earned were paid to his master, and that money went toward purchasing his freedom. Another question we have to answer is, how did Charles Deas come here? How did he end up here? He was from South Carolina. And if you know anything about the map, first portion of Habersham County touches South Carolina, so it's easy access. Now, South Carolina had a law that was enacted in 1775 that required all freed slaves to leave the state once they were given freedom. And if they didn't do so, they could be placed back into slavery. Maybe Charles Deas came to Clarkesville for that reason. He was freed and he had to leave. Another possibility for his coming here might have been he came with one of the founding fathers. I'm sure you remember names like Alexander Malden, A.J. Nichols, Reuben Clark, Hiram Proctor, Samson Sosby. All of these men were from South Carolina. Had he come with one of them? I don't know, but that's a possibility. Deas bought land from some of these people. He encountered others in the court system, and others were neighboring business owners. An act passed by Georgia legislature in 1818 required all free persons of color to register annually in the inferior court, with the inferior court clerk. In doing so, the clerk was charged with recording their names, their place of nativity, their descriptions, their occupations, and the time of their coming into the state. And the clerk could collect 50 cents for every person so registered. And you think about it, back in 1818, 50 cents was a fortune. The penalty for not registering was the possibility of being placed back into slavery. Did Charles register upon entering the state? I don't know. We've had two disasters here with the courthouse. And you know that the courthouse, I think, was burned on 2 occasions. Records were destroyed. And it's a possibility that some of those records that were destroyed held information about free people of color. Another third possibility as to why Charles came to Clarksville was the discovery of gold. In 1828, gold was discovered on Duke's Creek in the Coochie Valley. Did he come seeking a fortune? That's a possibility. Did he find gold? I don't know. But I do know that he bought from Alexander Malden on January 14, 1843, 70 acres of land. And the deed for that land mentions a vein of gold on the turnpike road to the entry of his property. So, no pictures exist to tell us how Charles looked. There's no birth certificate to tell us when he was born, or death certificate to tell us when he died and why he died. There are no school records to tell us how he learned to read and write, and he did learn to read and write. In every census, the 1850, 60, 70 census, he never said he could read and write, and that's usually a question on a census. But he could, and he had a very beautiful handwriting. See that handwriting if you go to the oath book that all people in the southern states that had withdrawn from the Union had to sign so that the state could be readmitted. I'll tell you about that in a little bit. But the records that we find in the census records, the property tax records, the oath book records, superior and inferior court records, a marriage license, and a will, help me paint a picture of who Charles Deas was. A December 23rd, 1833 act by the Georgia legislature concerning free people of color said that they had to have guardians. That was required, each of them. And they were given a letter that they carried with them to prove that they had registered. If these records existed, if they had not been destroyed, or if they were ever put in place, we would know more about Charles Deas. I'm going to digress a little bit and say this. Many of you know that we just saw the Academy Awards, and a picture that was nominated for, I don't know, Best Picture or Best Actress, I think Best Actress, the picture was Killers of the Flower Moon. And if you saw that, you know that the Osage Indians were required to have a guardian. I don't know if the situations were the same, but it's interesting that before 1865, free African Americans had to go have a guardian. And then in the 1920s, the Osage had to have guardians. Okay. Now, I've already said that we don't know when Charles got here, but we do know by looking at court records that on November 21st, 1837, a man named Antonio Deas sold Charles Deas 10 acres of land in District 10 for $100, a lot of money. Charles Deas was 30 years old then. Now, he was not supposed to conduct that sale himself. That sale was supposed to have gone through his guardian. I don't know why it didn't, but that was what happened. But that establishes his being here at that time. So did he have a guardian at that point? I don't know. Another court record shows that John T. Carter paid Charles Deas 62.5 cents for putting locks on the courthouse doors. That was in 1839. We don't have a record of Charles Deas petitioning the court for a guardian until 1840. Now remember when I said the law was put into effect, but it was 1840 when he petitioned John T. Carter to be his guardian. You had to go to the court and present a letter and ask that person to be your guardian, and then they would accept or deny. My great-great-grandmother had to do that. And other free persons of color had to ask for the protection of the guardian. Charles Deas was in Clarksville. Now, we've established his presence. As I told you earlier, he was a real estate investor. And between 1837 and 1856, he made at least 7 purchases of property. And all of these are documented in court records. They can be seen by going to the court records and looking at them. Now, I'll tell you one thing, it's hard to do so because they are in handwriting. Sometimes it's very difficult to read what people have written. One of the important purchases he made through John T. Carter was on December 3rd, 1856, when he bought land lot 2 in District 12 for $40. This became the site of his home. And his home was located in what was then known as Old Street. It was just right up the street, across from the courthouse. The house was located in the heart of town, and Charles Deas lived in that house until he died in 1873. And Amanda, according to his will, was allowed to live there for the rest of her life. In 1852, the Georgia legislature imposed a new poll tax on Charles Deas and other free people of color. The tax was increased to $5 per year on person. Now, my grandmother had several children, and at that time, can you imagine gathering that much to pay for your freedom? Freedom was not, as I say, free. Deas was a retail merchant, and that was an essential business in Clarksville. These were the stores that we usually call the general stores, and all of us have looked at pictures where there was a general store as a part of the town. These were the stores where people came to get items they needed, farm implements. They came to trade things. I remember when my grandmother used to trade at Burgess Trading Post. She'd bring eggs, and she would trade for kerosene and some other items. Charles Deas had a general store. The 1860 census gives us some more details. It tells us about the fact that he was a merchant. He was 53 years old, but he had a personal estate of $1,500. He was rich. And he had real estate valued at $2,500. And these items, some of them were taxable. He had to pay tax, and when we get ready for next Monday, you know what that means. The Civil War income tax was the first tax on individual incomes that the United States had. The annual tax assessment lists the names of those people who made more than $600 a year. A Form 23 assessment for persons in Division 7, that's this area, Collection District Number 4 for Georgia, so shows that for the month of October 1866, Charles Deas was taxed at a rate of 10%. The Civil War ended April 9, 1865. And that brought about changes, you know, for former slaves. They gained their freedom, but it brought about changes for Charles Deas. Because on November 28, 1866, 59-year-old Charles Deas married 38-year-old Amanda Nash, who had been owned once by tavern owner Reuben Nash. Amanda had a son named Joseph Jenkins, who was born just before 1850. And that was when Reuben Nash sold Amanda and her son to a man named William B. Woodward. Now Charles is married, he has a wife, and he has a stepson. After acquiring a family, Charles took his place in the history books because of the Reconstruction Act passed into law over President Johnson's veto. And these laws laid out readmission requirements for all states that had withdrawn from the Union. The Reconstruction Act of March 2, 1867 divided Georgia into 44 districts. Each district consisted of 3 counties and were overseen by a 3-member board. A man named John Pope, who was a career United States Army officer and had been a general in the Civil War, oversaw the first elections in Georgia, in which black Georgians participated. Pope named the 2 white board members for each of these districts in Georgia. And then those 2 men selected the black person who would serve with them. John Little and John M. Church selected Charles Deas. These men registered citizens in District 31, and these 3 counties consisted of Hart, Franklin, and Habersham counties. They had to travel around getting the signatures and administering the oath to every person, male person. We don't know very much about Charles and Amanda's life together. We do know that at some point Charles established Amanda in the business here on the square. Our next sizable information comes in 1872 in the property tax digest that shows Charles was taxed on 100 acres of land, city property valued at $800, and other property valued around $200. But in 1873, first of the year, he became ill, and he felt that death was imminent, so he drafted a will in his own handwriting. That will is a part of the records of what he had seen. He left the bulk of his estate to Amanda, and he also remembered his stepson. Now, after Charles' death, we can look at Amanda through the records of the Georgia Property Tax Digest. And if we look at those digests from 1874 to 1874 to 1883, you'll see that Amanda kept much of that property that her husband had left her. But 1884 is important. That was a year that she made the gift to this church of the property across the way on which the church at that time was located. We see the deed, and in that deed we see names mentioned: Zach Green, James Harris, George Burdale, Millington Burdale, Oliver Burdale, who were the trustees of the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church. Zach Green was my uncle, married my Aunt Georgia and Ivy. James Harris was my great-grandfather, married Holy Ivy. Amanda Deas gave that land to that colored church located across the way for as long as the building was used as a church. A couple of years later, the trustees agreed to, and Amanda, I should say, agreed to exchange the property for this lot here on which we are now proceeding to stand. Amanda signed the document on June 17, 1887, giving up the rights should the land cease to be used for religious purposes. If it had remained where it was, the property would have gone back to the Deas family. But in exchanging the property, it was free to be sold. Amanda's son, Joseph Jenkins, died on October 6, 1890. We don't have an exact date for Amanda's death, but she died somewhere between 1890 and 1893. We know that because in the Georgia Tax Digest, we see her name as Amanda Deas Estate. And at the time of her death, she still owned a considerable amount of property and city property valued at $1,773. Some of the earlier members, trustees of the church, passed on near the end of the 18th century, like Amanda, her son, and the others. But at just about that time, when they were leaving this earth, two people were being born. And those two people are the persons for whom we are here to talk about today, Henry and Clara Davis. Those people came into the church as young people and became benefactors. They worked hard to keep this church afloat, to keep it going in their lifetimes. Clara played the organ here, as we've talked about today, and I want to just end my speech by saying I remember her playing. I remember coming here with her. On a Sunday morning, she would get up and go through the neighborhood gathering all of us like little chickens to bring to the church. It was here that I learned what communion was. I've been posting a lot on Facebook lately, and some of the people have written some of the most wonderful things about her. One young lady spoke about the school, and she said it was always a pleasure for her to show up because she always had some treats for the children to eat. And that was true of her house. Whenever you went there, there was always something that she could offer you. some treat. She had an organ at home. Those of you who might remember her, remember that in that dining room was an organ. And I think back to one of my favorite books was there, a book by Zora Neale Hurston, Their Eyes Were Watching God. And she was trying to, Jamie's grandmother was trying to get her to marry this old man. She said, he has an organ. It's the only house that has an organ. It could be up on the main road with an organ. It wasn't an organ, it was a status symbol. I want to thank you for letting me come and share information about the benefactors of this church. I'm grateful to be here. I didn't grow up in Clarkesville, but I came to many activities. I can remember visiting my aunt and uncle so many times. My uncle who put his hand in his pocket and gave me a nickel or a dime. And that was big money. You don't get children nickels and dimes anymore. But that was special. Thank you for having me, and I hope that my thoughts, my words have added something to your information about this church.
Good afternoon. I'd like to I will be brief, but I would like to share a few memories from as I grew up here at Deas Chapel. 73 years ago, at the age of 9, I became a member of Deas Chapel Church. Miss Clara and Mr. Henry welcomed me to the church, and along with the minister, Miss Sandra Davis baptized me. I was raised directly across the street from Deas Chapel. I grew up on this side of town, and I was very instrumental in the things that went on at the Deas Chapel Church. I remember probably at the age of 5 or 6, Mr. Henry Davis asked the lady across the street, Miss Moon, if I could possibly start fires on Sunday mornings at the church. If you would look up in the center of the building, that's where we had an old, what we call then a pot-bellied wood heater. And Mr. Henry Davis would come from across town every Sunday morning that we had worship, and we'd build a fire. And he said, well, gosh, there's that little boy there that's old enough to strike a match. Why not let him build a fire? So they all agreed that I would start building fires. And back then we had two churches, the Black Church, Methodist, and the Black Baptist. And we rotated. Every first and third Sundays was Methodist, and second and fourth was Baptist. So Mr. Henry, every first and third Sunday, would come over and build fires. So they agreed, and I agreed, that I would start building fires, which I did. Starting salary for the fires, my starting salary was 25 cents per Sunday. And every other Sunday they would pay me a quarter. But I was given a nickel every Sunday to put in the collection plate. So by the time I took my deductions, I only made 20 cents or 40 cents a month. But I remember as a little kid, mischievous and whatever, that nickel that my parents had given me to go in the church collection, I went uptown to the dime store, and I bought what back then what they call an all-day lollipop. And that all-day lollipop cost me 4 cents. So on Sunday morning, I only had 1 cent to go in the collection plate. I gave the church my last penny. I have a lot of fond memories of being here at the Deas Chapel. One particular story I recall is that when we had a new preacher, and he was new to the community. And back then, it was a procedure for the pastor to ask for someone to lead us in prayer. So this new pastor, he asked one of the members if you would lead us in prayer. And the member looked at that preacher and said, "That's what we're paying you to do. You lead in prayer." So after then, the preacher asked for volunteers. He didn't call anybody. Then over the years, as the church started deteriorating, we didn't have any members. My wife and I were at the time probably the only two paying members of the church that was left. But anyhow, Clarkesville Methodist Church got involved, and they chose this church as a project. And we came in here. If you'll notice, it's a different floor from the two different colors. The CP Wilbanks Lumber Company donated the lumber. We pretty much restored the church, built a new building outside for the men and women's restroom, and we got started from there. And then during that time, we didn't have any parking, so Mr. Hal Woods, who bought property joining us, he donated in-kind contribution land to the church, and we finally had parking. And we were trying to get some money at one time to do some repairs on the church, and somebody made the suggestion that we get with the National Historical Society and apply for a grant or whatever. And Dr. Hodges and the city of Clarksville, we all got together and made application for a grant. We did receive the application, and this at the time and still is the only black history that's named to the National History of Historical Places. And we thank the city of Clarksville and Dr. Hodges for all that. So, during that time, the Standard Telephone Company, the H.M. Stewart Senior Telephone Pioneer Club installed the ceiling fans, and we did some windows and all that as part of the renovation. So, that is said that very much. I would be brief, and I will. But I will say that Mr. Henry and Miss Clara were true members of society. There was never occasion that, whether it was a funeral or wedding or gathering or whatever, that Miss Clara didn't have a poem to read. She knew poems like something, I don't know what. And sometimes I think she knew more poems than Helen Rice did. She was memorized word by word, everything. So Mr. Henry was known by everyone in Northeast Georgia. He was the telephone man at that particular time. If you had a phone service, you called Mr. Davis. And I appreciate the work of Standard Telephone Company and Mr. Stewart Sr. that was dedicated to making this church what it is today. If there was a leak in the roof, Mr. Stewart made sure that Mr. Henry got funds or whatever needed to repair. And for that, we're all grateful. I can best describe Mr. and Mrs. Davis as two people whose whole life was devoted to God and to mankind. And to the very end, they served them both. Thank you.
I have many more than one fond memory. But I'll tell you one thing that I remember the best. We were living in Clarksville, and we walked from over there, past where Mr. Henry Davis lived, to the church. And my number one memory is the sound of Miss Clara's voice. She was a singer, but somehow another. Oh, it was almost like she was an opera singer, and her voice was so strong and light, and then she played the organ. And it seems like I can remember once or twice she would want us to sing a little louder or a little more energy or something. That's one great memory of it. But my number one, Roman numeral one memory, Miss Clara was a great cook. And she was a lovely hostess. If you ever went to her house after church, as we did many times, and ate lunch with them, oh, the spread of the table, first of all, you couldn't believe when did she do all this cooking? But she did a lot of cooking, and she did a mighty good job. So every time you study, it looks like you're running out of what's on your plate. And Mr. Henry would look over there, he said, have something on your plate. We just take a little more, but it was wonderful going there. To me, they were almost like an extra uncle aunt. If I had spent more time around them, if I could spend more time at their house, they'd be like an extra set of grandparents. They were wonderful. And so every time we talk of history, there's nobody that can be left out. My history, your history, everybody's connected. So especially listening to Will Lockwood, because I knew Will Lockwood before I went to the first grade. So it's a great occasion that we're having today. I thank you all very much for being here. Thank you.
One other thing about Aunt Clara, since I've heard it mentioned from Will and lady here, about her always having a poem or something to say. And that was a result of the education that she received. Mr. S.B. Avery was her teacher, and she's often told us about that, as well as the Doris here, they shared that with me. At that time, blacks did not have books. They were not able to buy the textbooks. So much of what they did in school was through memorization. And in one of the books that Mr. Stewart wrote, he said that when he came, my uncle had all of the numbers in his memory. And that was because you had to memorize things at school. That was something he had learned, and he applied it to his business. And my Aunt Clara did have a poem or something that she could say to inspire, to uplift you. And that came from the education. There were some positives in that education they received at that time. And that was one of them, the ability to memorize. I have one that I take that Jeannene remembered that her mom used to recite. And it was interesting. It was cute. It was about a little boy, about a little girl, and how he showed himself, he showed off. He said some things he shouldn't have said. And she gave the door. But those things are things that come back to you and bring a smile to your face. I can remember her at a funeral in South Carolina, and she got up and spoke, and she ended her words with a poem. And there's not many of us that can recite a poem from memory. I taught English for 30-something years, and I very few I can recite.
Yes, Carolyn, thank you.
We've spent all day today and yesterday, ever since you talked to us, talking about how much we loved Henry and Claire, how much they meant to our family, and there's just not enough words to say how much we appreciate it and what y'all meant. I appreciate all the things that all of you said, and all the way back to Dad Stewart. Henry was just, Stewart and Dean and all of us. He was just special. And my husband always says that Clara always was just so close to his heart, because he ate there so many times and spent so much time with them and all. So, and the other thing is, Jeb was saying in the car on the way up, and we say all the time, Stuart, how much we appreciate you, and how much Dad Stewart and your mom and everybody in the family is proud of you, and how you carry on the appreciation for this family and what they meant to all of us.
Great. Well, let me do this. I'm going to share a couple of remarks, and I'm actually going to read a letter that my grandfather wrote about Henry. Before I do that, it's my privilege, at this time, it's my privilege to really represent a family, if you will, or a group of people known as the men and women of Standard Telephone Company. My father, Dean Swanson, is here in the back. Wave, Dad. Milt Stewart Jr., and of course Carolyn Stewart, Jeb, their son. And I know everybody from Standard that's here, please stand up. Truett, Will, Helen, yes. Oh, wow. So, when I finish reading the letter, I'm going to ask all of you to come up, and together we're going to lift and expose the organ here. So hang on. But anyway, the men and women of Standard Telephone Company, they worked for the company between 1939 and 1999. Now, as we all know, the company is Windstream. The telephone company, though, was founded right here in Clarkesville. Milo York's house is literally, what, Will, 200 feet that way? I mean, we are that close to where the telephone company was actually formed, right here in Clarksville. Come on and see, there's a road right there. How about that? Milo York formed the company originally, and one of his very first employees was Henry Davis. Henry Davis was 14 years old when he went to work for the telephone company. 14. It was a tough job. It was a hard job. Everything we take for granted today, back then, obviously, was very, very difficult. Cutting telephone poles, raising telephone poles, stringing the wire, going to the homes and mounting telephones and getting them working and charging up the batteries and the magnetos and all that. It was hard. It was hard. And Henry took on to it. He figured everything out on his own without any formal education and just did an incredible, incredible job. That started the relationship with my grandfather, who in 1939 purchased the company from Milo York. And at that time, Henry, pretty much like it was stated by Evelyn, Henry knew everything. He knew all the phone numbers. He knew the operators, the cord switchboard operators. He knew how everything worked. Everything was in his head. And when my grandfather first met Henry, he was just astounded. Here is one individual that knows every single thing about the telephone, what we now call telephone networks. And Henry was just an incredible guy. Impressed my grandfather day one. It's a relationship that stayed strong for the next 4 decades until Henry Davis retired in 1967. The relationship would culminate, and Carolyn is very much aware of this, and it's in most of the books, with my grandfather declaring that Henry Davis was the most profound individual that he had ever known. My grandfather met thousands and thousands and thousands of people. Henry Davis was the most profound person that he had ever known. And my grandfather would always say that he owed a debt of gratitude to Henry Davis. My grandfather's whole life was around that debt of gratitude and repaying those that help you. Henry would go on to become one of the most highly respected and trusted individuals in the Clarksville community. He got involved with the city. Obviously, Clara was running a lot of programs for the community right here in this chapel. My grandfather would continue promoting Henry to the highest levels of responsibility inside the company. And Henry, as it turns out, would be one of the first, if not the first, member of his race to become a fully fledged senior craftsman in the complete art of telephony, meaning he knew every aspect of the entire telephone network, how it worked, what had to be done to make it work, and it was all right up here in his head. When you put Henry's craft behind the telephone industry, what amazed my grandfather was Henry's discipline and his self-respect, and his self-respect of others. That's what won my grandfather's heart with Henry Davis and Clara. He loved the way Henry met what he called exasperating situations with respectful dignity and humility. We all know the challenges that the black race had early in the century, right? And that that to my grandfather never existed. He respected everyone, and he thought that Henry, pound for pound, was far higher and above anybody else that he had ever known. And that speaks to my grandfather as well. But anyway, what they were doing here in this church, what they did for the city of Clarksville, pretty much incredible. I want to read you a letter that my grandfather wrote, and this, I believe, was around 1977, may have been 78, but it was after Henry had been selected to be the Grand Marshal of the Mountain Laurel Parade Festival here in Clarksville. And everybody wanted to know more about Henry. Tell us about this guy, Henry. Tell us about Clara. So I'll read the letter to you. But before I do that, I want to say this. So in 1977, Henry Davis was selected as the Grand Marshal of the Clarksville Mountain Laurel Parade. Shortly after, he received a letter from none other than President Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter wrote to Henry Davis. And in my mind, President Carter was saying in many ways, and using his own words, he was sending his own message to Henry Davis, to Henry's family, to the city of Clarksville, to Deas Chapel, and to our area African American residents that, guess what, Randy? You are loved, right? I truly look back on that now, on that letter from President Carter. What more was he doing than just saying, you are loved, right? But I'll read the letter, and I'll be quick. So this went to a Susan. I'm not sure who Susan was. Probably a newspaper editor or reporter. So my grandfather writes, as stated over the telephone, I find your request for comments on Henry Davis staggering. With such an exemplary subject, it would seem to be a simple matter to just open the mouth and let the words tumble over each other for an infinite period. But that is just the trouble. There is so very much that can be said about Henry that it becomes a formidable job to crystallize and capsule the abundance of material that characterizes Henry. Since time is of the essence, and since the task of weaving the story is yours, I shall jot down, without regard to form or sequence, the substance of a few memories. First off, it is my conviction that the highest compliment a man can aspire to be is to be recognized as a gentleman. I have long regarded Henry Davis as the epitome of the term. Henry Davis, a gentleman, a father, a husband. At the celebration of his retirement, I reported that I found Henry to be a selfish sort of person, that this trait was evidenced in his daily life. He was so selfish, he craved the respect and affection of those about him, and he wanted to enjoy the peace and contentment of a clear conscience. So, he had patterned his life toward attaining these goals. In essence, Henry's brand of selfishness drove him to devote his intelligence, his energy, his talent, and his time to the needs, wants, and comfort of others, not himself. At the time of his retirement in 1967, Henry Davis may well have been the best known and most highly respected man in Habersham County. His work with the telephone company took him into nearly all business places and most of the homes inside the county. His personality and devotion to people did the rest. This is confirmed by an actual experience. And I won't go into all the detail, but there was a problem with a telephone line in Dahlonega, Georgia. And you know, getting from here to Dahlonega back then was not the easiest of tasks, but Henry left here, went all the way to Dahlonega, spent a couple of days, got that situation cleared up, and from that point on, in the Dahlonega community, Henry Davis was very well known. to the point that when anybody had a problem with their telephone, they would come to Clarksville and say, would you send Henry Davis to Dahlonega to fix my phone? But anyway, Henry Davis was already a part of Standard Telephone Company when we purchased the system in 1939. At that time, and for some time afterward, he was the only plant employee that the company had. There was no time off for Henry. You couldn't take a vacation, right? You're the only one. And so you can imagine the demands on Henry. And he loved the job, he loved the company, he loved the people that he worked with, and he never ever turned down any requests. There's articles that were written in the 1940s in the Tri-County Advertiser where they talked about Henry Davis getting up at 3 a.m. in the morning to go work a telephone issue. That was actually in 1960 when the government was forming up, I guess prior to the space race and everything that was going on. They were setting up civil areas in each of the towns to handle communication. But anyway, 3 o'clock in the morning, right? But it goes on to say that since he had been birthed and raised in what we call now in the telephone industry, the old world magneto type facilities, that's where you had the crank phones, remember, and a switchboard operator, everything was manual. In 1956 or 57, and Audrey, great pick on the telephone, this is a dial telephone. I know these are gone now too. My grandfather was so concerned that Henry knew everything about the telephone industry, but now the phone industry was going to dial. That means every number had to be dialed, every number had to be decrypted when it gets back to this central office. And my grandfather was like, oh my gosh, Henry's got to learn how this is done, how dial telephony works, how it gets decrypted, how the lines get connected. But to his amazement, he goes on to say, to our happy surprise, Henry took to the newfangled apparatus like the proverbial duck to water. This is evidenced in the fact that he would then become the chief serviceman for the entire Clarksville Exchange dial office. So you can imagine Henry starting his career at age 14. 30, 40 years later, with his own intelligence, he learns what then was the most sophisticated telephone dialing system that had ever been invented. But anyway, my grandfather goes on to say, I'm indebted to Henry, and that word is critical. We know what that means. I am indebted to Henry for some of the most profound and rewarding lessons that I can recall. Who was teaching who? It was Henry teaching my grandfather as much as my grandfather teaching Henry. During his day, people of his race were rarely seen among telephone craftsmen. It was quite common to see eyebrows lifted and Henry subjected to personal indignities and embarrassment as trained personnel from other localities were brought into our organization. But the cool, calm, collected, and intelligent way in which Henry went about showing himself to be the master of such situations was a joy to behold and the measure of his stature as a man, as a gentleman. Within a matter of days, he would have these people literally eating out of his hands and ready to fight on his side. Colorful stories are plentiful, but one evidences the high esteem in which Henry was held by those he served so faithfully. A lady once called the operator one afternoon and said, I am over at Miss Blank's playing bridge today. My telephone at home is out of order. Please send Henry to fix it. Tell him the key is under the flower pot on the back porch. That is a level of trust you can't get any greater than that, right? I would continue, but I would, I shall not risk becoming tiresome. I hope you will find something out of the foregoing that will meet your needs and wishes. Let me add that Clarksville is indeed fortunate to have a citizen of Henry Davis's caliber, and the community has done itself proud in honoring him in such a traditional way. And that's when the city made him the Grand Marshal of the 1977 Mount Laurel Festival. Stand up here.
I would just like to say, I remember my dad so well. I remember when he first started working for the telephone company, he drove this little red truck. And I remember on Saturday, he would buy a big bag of candy. And we'd go out to the truck, and the first thing we'd ask, where's the candy? And then he'd give us 25 cents, and we'd go to the movie. The movie was 15 cents. And we had another 10 cents to buy a bag of popcorn. And I remember so many just wonderful things about him. And I remember too, when he was working, I guess, for Mr. York at that time. And anyway, and Mr. York had some other temporary people working for him also. And what they were doing, splicing the wires. And I guess these older men, they were just splicing the wires just any kind of way, you know. And so my dad, he got a little upset. He said, why are you letting this, get by? You're not doing this correctly. And so my dad got a little upset. He said, well, I can go home and help my dad on the farm, because his dad had a big farm. And anyway, so he threw the hooks in the truck. And he said he was going to wait for this train called the TF at that time. It ran through Clarksville all the way to Atlanta. And so he said, well, he would take the TF to go home, because where my grandfather lived, the TF train ran right past the farm. And anyway, so my dad threw the hooks in the truck, and he made Mr. York think that he got on the train. And anyway, so after a while, my dad pulled off. And so Mr. York came back, and Mr. York gave him 15 cents. So go and buy yourself an ice cream cone and cool off. So my dad took the hooks back out of the truck, and he put them back on, and he never stopped working after that.
I'm in awe to be here, but I would like to recite a poem that my mom taught us that she learned when she was in school, and it goes like this. I went to church last Sunday, and what a time I had. I met Will Hick and Henry, made old Henry mad. Come asking me for company, while a little old crazy gump. I felt like picking up a rock and making that boy jump. But we all went home with Martha, and she asked us all to dine. We had cake, we had jam, we had jelly. Oh, we just had a lovely time. But some people will be gluttons, no matter what you do. But I always act ladylike, and manners takes me through.
Jackie Hodges. So when we talked about the Habersham County Historical Society, Jackie has done decades of work. Her husband, Dr. Hodges, started a lot of that. My grandfather was involved early on, but thank you so much. And she continues to this day to serve the Historical Society. Well, so let's do this. If everybody who has ever been employed with Standard Telephone Company wants to come forward, any place you can find. So I think we'll stay on point with the messaging of you are loved. So when we're ready, let's all three say you are loved, and we'll pull it. Okay? You are loved.
When Michael came and took the organ apart, we were here. He said, "This is amazing. There's no water damage. There's no insect damage. There's no rot in it." He said, "If any of those things were present, we could not do anything." So it was protected here in this church. And the church did a really good job protecting it. So.
shine.